In May 2019, FIFA President Gianni Infantino joined such notable luminaries as Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich, British royal Prince Michael of Kent, and the vehemently homophobic and authoritarian Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov in being awarded with the Order of Friendship, a title which was bestowed upon him by Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation a year after Russia hosted the FIFA World Cup. The Order of Friendship is a state decoration and the Russian Federation's successor to the Soviet Order of Friendship of Peoples. In his acceptance speech at the Kremlin, in Vladimir Putin's presence, Infantino addressed Putin personally, saying, "Thank you, dear President," before congratulating Russia on hosting what he described as the greatest World Cup ever. Less than 3 years on, both FIFA and UEFA have been forced to sever their close ties with Putin and Russia after Russian forces invaded Ukraine, leading to widespread international condemnation. Gianni Infantino has refused to comment on whether he will be returning the Order of Friendship that was presented to him by the Russian Federation, and has refused to condemn his old pal Vladimir Putin personally. Initially, football's two largest and most powerful governing bodies refused to even kick Russia out of their competitions, instead stating that Russia would have to play matches using the name and representing only a football union of Russia rather than Russia itself. A mealy-mouthed and meaningless punishment, if ever there was one. On the face of it, the bombs that currently rain down on the cities of Kharkiv and Kyiv, killing innocent civilians as further Russian reinforcements head towards Ukraine, might seem to have little to do with football. Indeed, many have labelled FIFA and UEFA's delayed decision to ban Russia from their competitions meaningless, as hospitals are bombed and people lose their lives. But for all of its messages of solidarity and gestures of goodwill now towards Ukraine, football cannot wash its hands with the conflict that is currently happening there, nor can it deny its role in the rise of Vladimir Putin, his consolidation of control over the largest country in the world, and the creation of a web of Russian money that runs right through the heart of world football, orchestrated by a handful of oligarchs and companies with inextricable ties to the Putin regime. This is the story of how Vladimir Putin manipulated the world of football and won, and both how and why it was allowed to happen. Lots has been made of the decision to award Qatar with 2022 FIFA World Cup hosting rights, though still not nearly enough, whether that be in regard to the conditions of migrant workers building stadiums in the searing West Asian heat, the vast array of human rights abuses committed by Qatar, both before and since their successful bid, or just the corrupt process which saw Qatar awarded with those hosting rights in the first place. Yet, far less was said, and still has been said, of Russia's successful bid. There was some controversy in England in 2010 when Russia and Qatar were announced as the 2018 and 2022 World Cup hosts, though mostly just about the voting process and alleged corruption, which stemmed largely from grievances around England's own bid, whilst far from squeaky clean, not having been quite corrupt enough to convince FIFA that England was capable of hosting the tournament. Very little was made about whether Russia were actually suitable World Cup hosts worthy of being awarded with the largest event in all of world sport. That is despite the fact that Russia is a dictatorship where elections are rigged, the press is not free, and dissidents have a nasty habit of going missing in mysterious circumstances. FIFA has always had a relaxed attitude towards rewarding repressive regimes though, and so long as the tournament itself was a success, world football's governing body could forgive the rest. Russia officially spent more than $4 billion hosting the 2018 World Cup, though it is still unclear both where a lot of that money came from and also where a lot of it went. Vladimir Putin called upon his country's small number of extremely wealthy oligarchs to dip into their deep pockets and help out, in what were construed as being not very thinly veiled threats from the Russian president. Meanwhile, those involved in local and central government were often accused of having done really rather well out of some of Russia's World Cup construction and renovation projects. The Krestovsky Stadium in St. Petersburg, for example, which is now known as the Gazprom Arena for sponsorship reasons, which was also due to host the 2022 Champions League final, started out with a budget of $250 million. Following a string of delays and added expenses, the stadium ended up costing at least $1.5 billion and took 9 years to build. Very little of that, more than $4 billion in total, ever ended up in the hands of the people who actually built and renovated those 11 World Cup stadiums. Construction workers on Russia's mammoth footballing arenas were paid extraordinarily low wages, if anything at all, in some instances. Some of the labourers who worked on Russia's World Cup stadiums were imported from North Korea, sent to Russia from North Korea, with the fee for their labour being paid by Russia to North Korea directly, rather than by Russia to the workers themselves. In 2018, there were an estimated 50,000 North Korean workers based in Russia. I would not throw around a word like slavery lightly, but in this instance, it is difficult to find any other way in which to describe it. At least 21 workers are reported to have died whilst building or renovating the stadiums that hosted the 2018 World Cup. This, Gianni Infantino claims, is what constituted the greatest World Cup ever. Presumably only Qatar in 2022, a tournament which is being built by more slaves than the city of Washington DC, will be able to top it in his eyes. In telling Russia that there is no place for human rights abusing nations at the upcoming World Cup in Qatar of all places, Gianni Infantino has at least upheld FIFA's proud tradition not only of corruption and moral objection, but also of crippling hypocrisy. Yes, in 2016, FIFA finally moved on from an era marred by corruption and scandal overseen by a self-interested Swiss administrator and replaced him with, well, you get the idea. I believe it was the American self-help guru and LAFC investor Tony Robbins who said, "By changing nothing, nothing changes." Following England's failed World Cup bid, British intelligence officer Christopher Steele was hired to look into FIFA's voting process, amid widespread allegations of corruption, vote swapping, and vote purchasing. ESPN linked Qatar's success to their Football Dreams project, which funded football in 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America, 6 of which had representatives on FIFA's executive committee. And Sepp Blatter even acknowledged himself that there had been attempted vote sharing by the Spanish and Qatari bids, but claimed that they hadn't worked. Steele's findings accused Igor Sechin, a Russian oligarch and longtime close confidant of Vladimir Putin's, who is often described as being Russia's de facto deputy president and as the second most powerful man in Russia, of having used bribery to rig the voting process. The Steele dossier, as it became known, later snowballed into an investigation into whether Russia had collected a file of compromising information about Donald Trump, leading to allegations of collusion between Putin and Trump. The investigation into FIFA corruption, meanwhile, was picked up by US Attorney Michael J. Garcia, who was appointed directly by FIFA and eventually published the Garcia report in September 2014. The report was allegedly pretty scathing of FIFA and some of its top brass, so FIFA refused to publish it, instead publishing a redacted 42-page summary which Garcia described as being materially incomplete and resigned from his post. In the end, it took US federal prosecutors to disclose numerous corruption cases, which finally prompted some arrests and resignations, though arguably very little in terms of genuine culture change at FIFA. The unpublished Garcia report had been much more scathing in its criticisms of Qatar's victorious World Cup bid than it had been about Russia's. Not because Russia's bid was squeaky clean, but because Garcia had been unable to obtain virtually any of the relevant material involved in Russia's successful bidding process. Garcia was banned outright from even entering Russia in 2013, and he was told that the Russian bidding team's computers from 2010 had, rather conveniently, all been destroyed, with no data able to be retrieved. The computers in question did not belong to the Russian state or even to the Russian Football Union, but rather they were actually leased from another familiar face, namely Roman Abramovich. Russia's World Cup bidding committee rented the computers from the Yuri Konoplyev Football Academy, a football academy which is based in the Russian city of Tolyatti, which is operated by Abramovich's own Academy of Football. It is yet another in a long line of striking coincidences which link Roman Abramovich to Russian politics, the Russian state, and to the Putin regime if, like Carvis Solkal from Sky Sports, you believe that the Chelsea owner is not involved in politics and is not involved with Vladimir Putin. It is tempting to think that football and sport don't really matter, in the grand scheme of things. But Vladimir Putin certainly wouldn't agree with that sentiment, and neither would a litany of leaders, from democratically elected presidents to dictators and despots alike. Benito Mussolini did not go to great lengths to both host and ensure Italy's success at the 1934 World Cup because he loved football. Nor did Nazi Germany spend a fortune hosting the 1936 Summer Olympic Games because they wanted to bring Jesse Owens to Berlin and see him take part in the long jump up close and personal. This stuff matters, and sport has always played an important role in how Vladimir Putin portrays himself, particularly to the Russian people. Putin rarely misses an opportunity to exhibit his own supposed physical prowess, frequently being seen in heavily choreographed and often rather ludicrous photographs of him working out, hunting, fishing, riding horses, getting into judo fights and more. Almost all whilst he is topless and presumably thinks that he looks a million rubles. Not that a million rubles is worth very much following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Indeed, for a man who is famous for his anti-LGBT views and legislation, Putin doesn't half seem to have been inspired by the movie Brokeback Mountain a lot of the time. Putin's own sporting accomplishments may be little more than pageantry and propaganda, with the Hobbit-like despot accused of having fought bogus Judas bouts against Fall Guys to ensure his success. He is, after all, 69 years old now, but the many sporting events that Russia has hosted over the past 20 years, which play an equally important role in Putin's propaganda campaigns, have been very real. The Winter Olympics in 2014, which took place in the Russian city of Sochi, was the most expensive Olympics of all time, and it is not even close. I'm not just talking about the Winter Olympics either, I mean any Olympics. Russia spent $16 billion solely on sporting costs to host the competition, and $50 billion, yes, 50 billion in total on hosting the games. That is more than 3 times the amount of money that the United Kingdom spent on hosting the 2012 Summer Olympics in London. But Sochi was small fry in terms of its global and domestic appeal, along with its importance to Russia and to Putin in comparison to the 2018 World Cup. Of the oligarchs who Putin supposedly asked to help fund, or perhaps more likely told to help fund, Russia's 2018 World Cup project, many will be familiar faces to anyone with an interest in football. Roman Abramovich is perhaps the most high profile, having been Chelsea's free-spending owner since 2003, with the Blues having won every trophy on offer to them since then, including both the Premier League and the Champions League, on more than one occasion. Abramovich was a close confidant of Russia's first post-Soviet president, Boris Yeltsin, a man who succeeded only in crippling the Russian economy whilst enriching those closest to him. And the Chelsea owner was reportedly the very first person to recommend to Yeltsin that Putin be his successor. In addition to Abramovich, you have Alisher Usmanov, who is even richer than Abramovich and was at one time believed to be the largest individual shareholder at Arsenal. Usmanov no longer owns shares in Arsenal, but he has had close ties to Everton ever since his business partner, Farhad Mashiri, acquired the club. Usmanov has invested and sponsored Everton, though the Toffees reportedly severed their official ties to him during the same day that I wrote this video, perhaps due to the European Union freezing all of his assets in Europe due to his close relationship with Putin. Usmanov has been a loyal ally of Putin's and posted a couple of bizarre videos on the internet attacking Alexei Navalny, Putin's most high-profile political opponent in Russia, who was left in a serious condition following a poisoning with the Novichok nerve agent in 2020. Usmanov's first video directed at Navalny ended with the words, "I spit on you," and he signed off his second video by stating, "I spit on you again." The Uzbek-born billionaire is nothing if not consistent. Unlike Everton, as it happens. Once a keen fencer, Usmanov is essentially the sole funder of Russian fencing, in addition to his investments in football, proving the importance of sport to Putin and his allies once again. Elsewhere, you have got Dmitry Rybolovlev, who owns AS Monaco, Leonid Fedun, who has a significant ownership stake in Spartak Moscow and made a £400 million bid to buy Wolverhampton Wanderers in 2021, Yevgeny Gina, who owns CSKA Moscow and heads up the financial committee of the Russian Football Union, and Suleiman Kerimov, who famously bought FC Anji Makachkala in 2011, very briefly investing a fortune in the club and signing the likes of Samuel Eto'o and Roberto Carlos before pulling his funding and selling up, in a move that devastated the club in 2016. I could go on. The amount of Russian money in football, considering that Russia isn't actually an enormously wealthy country in terms of GDP, ranking 11th, below the likes of Italy and Canada, is staggering. Every one of the football-involved oligarchs that I just mentioned, and almost every billionaire barring one that I'm aware of in Russia, amassed the bulk of their personal fortune, or at least their initial fortune, due to political connections that they established during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which allowed them to purchase privatized state assets for ludicrously low prices. Russia is a nation that is extremely rich in natural resources, so most of these fortunes were built off the back of formerly nationalized oil, gas, and steel companies, along with a handful of banks, thrown in there for good measure. Abramovich, for example, was able to acquire the Russian oil giant Sibneft for $100 million in 1995, when the actual value of the company was likely several billion dollars. The investment effectively made Abramovich a billionaire overnight, and Abramovich later admitted in court that he had paid billions of dollars of bribes to government officials and gangsters to acquire and protect his assets over the years. Many of Russia's oligarchs, at some point, had something to do with Gazprom, or had their wealth inflated by ownership or association with the largest company in Russia. Sibneft, the oil giant, once owned by Abramovich, is now named Gazprom Neft and is a subsidiary of Gazprom, who own 96% of the company's shares. Usmanov, meanwhile, became the general director of Gazprom Invest Holdings during the 1990s, and stayed with the company up until 2014. As many of you will be aware, Gazprom is a company with a sizable footprint within the world of football. They are, or were, Schalke's shirt sponsors, Red Star Belgrade shirt sponsors, Chelsea's energy partners, one of the chief sponsors of both the 2018 FIFA World Cup and the 2020 UEFA European Championships. They were the official sponsors of the UEFA Champions League until very recently, having replaced Heineken in 2012, and they own Zenit St. Petersburg, who just so happen to be Vladimir Putin's favourite club. Alexei Miller, who is Gazprom's CEO, rather amusingly described the company by stating that, quote, "Gazprom is not only the largest gas company in the world, but is also one of the most passionate about football," in a statement relating to the club's partnership with UEFA, and specifically in that instance, with the Champions League. I do enjoy the idea that a gas company has passions rather like a person. I wonder if there are any gas companies that love badminton, Pop-Tarts, or the music of Bach. Yes, Gazprom's role within the European game is pretty significant. I mean, Alexander Dukov, who is the president of the Russian FA, is literally also the chairman of the board at Gazprom. If you wanted to be kind about Russia and Putin's attempts to cynically exploit football, you would have to concede that they have at least done it out in the open with little interest in subtlety or disguise. Throughout this time, there has been next to no opposition to Russian money, with close ties to Putin, flooding the English and European games, at least not from anyone who matters. That is partly because, in England at least, vast wealth is in of itself treated as a virtue. If you are immensely rich, you must therefore be very smart and very benevolent, And if you are willing to invest heaps of that money into a football team, you won't just be able to buy yourself the best players and the biggest trophies, but also the affection of thousands, if not millions of supporters, who will support and defend you at just about every juncture. There is an unusual stronghold that football has over people to make them alter their entire worldview, and I think this is best expressed in the way in which supporters of clubs will celebrate their own owners bending the rules and getting away with things that they, as ordinary people who aren't filthy rich, simply would not be able to. I remember the way in which Manchester City fans delighted in photos of the club's legal team, funded by their Emirati royal, as the club fought back against UEFA and alleged FFP and accounting breaches. Or the way in which some Derby County fans, before the proverbial hit the fan, relished in Mel Morris's ability to effectively cook the books by acquiring Pride Park on his own behalf to avoid their own financial mismanagement from being punished. Of course, that would only prove to be a temporary reprieve for the Rams. The remarkable effectiveness of sports washing, as it has become known, will lead ordinary people in the United Kingdom, for example, who are currently struggling to pay their rent, mortgage, bills, and buy groceries, to make idols and saints of billionaire despots and oligarchs who steal their nation's wealth and are complicit in war crimes. It is vital to stress that the Russian people are not the enemy of the average person or the average football fan, but merely powerless pawns in a machine that is totally disinterested in them, just like them. The actual enemy, oftentimes, are the owners they have been taught and told to love, with whom they have virtually nothing in common except perhaps for a shared association with a specific football team, because of the idea that wealth is a virtue and questioning the source of that wealth is tantamount to treason. And even if they don't comply, and indeed do truly despise their owners, there is often very little that fans can do, and few mechanisms that exist in English football to truly empower them. Just take a look at Manchester United and the Glazers, but there I digress. Vladimir Putin is very good at turning every situation and every outcome, even ones which might initially appear to be negative to non-Russians, into a win for him at home. When Russia hosts the World Cup, Winter Olympics, and other major sporting events, that is because the rest of the world is in awe of Russia's majesty and ability to organise and showcase their showpiece events. It is directly because of Putin and his outstanding leadership of Russia that the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi, and Mohamed Salah descended upon the cities of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Rostov-on-Don. But when Russia is sanctioned by the international community, as they have been in recent weeks, that is often not viewed as the opposite, a sign of failure in terms of Putin's leadership, but rather as a cynical attack on the Russian people by the West, who are afraid of Russia's progress and do not want the country to succeed. That might seem a bit silly, absurd even, and of course, many Russians can see through it. But in a country with an extremely strictly regulated press, a large number of people do buy into these ideas. To be clear, Russians are not uniquely or even distinctly gullible or naive. Far from it, in fact. Roman Abramovich's press people in recent weeks have tried to sell the line that Abramovich has nothing to do with Russian politics or Vladimir Putin, whilst he literally assists talks between Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, and also that he has stepped away from his involvement in Chelsea, whilst he still owns all of their assets, and there is no lack of people in England, including journalists no less, who have been willing to lap up that enormous feast of insulting nonsense and believe it. Now Abramovich is claiming that not only is Chelsea up for sale, but if there are any proceeds from that sale, he will donate them to the victims of the conflict in Ukraine. And if you believe that A, there would be any proceeds in the event of Abramovich selling Chelsea right now, B, that he would donate those proceeds to victims in Ukraine, and C, that even if A and B happened, that all of that cash wouldn't be channeled to pro-Russian separatist groups in Ukraine, well, then all I can say is that I've got a lovely looking bridge to sell you, should you be interested. FIFA and UEFA really do appear to have cut ties with Putin for now. not because of any newfound morality in the sport, not even directly because of Russia waging a war of aggression in Ukraine, but because it is no longer politically or economically expedient for FIFA or UEFA to maintain those close ties. Put simply, the negatives of being friends with Vladimir Putin now outweigh the positives for Alexander Safarin and Gianni Infantino. But in his spineless platitudes, Infantino still made sure to leave the door open for a rekindling of his relationship with Vladimir Putin should this all eventually die down. FIFA seriously expects us to believe that up until 2018, Vladimir Putin was such a standout guy that Russia should not only receive no sanctions or punishment from the organisation, but they should be rewarded with the greatest honour that FIFA can bestow upon a nation, FIFA World Cup hosting rights. Meanwhile, UEFA wants us to rest assured that up until, well, about a week ago, Putin was still such a stellar fella that there was no reason why his birthplace of St. Petersburg and the home ground of the club that is closest to his heart shouldn't be allowed to host the biggest game in European club football. And that only about a week after Russian troops marched, drove and flew into Ukraine on Vladimir Putin's orders and, began shelling buildings and murdering innocent civilians, did he suddenly become a bad guy in their eyes. Yet, for FIFA, Qatar remain perfectly suitable hosts of the next World Cup, a nation which has committed roughly one human rights violation per citizen since their successful bid in 2010, has stadiums built on the backs of slaves, and won what was perhaps the most corrupt bid in the history of an organisation that is renowned for ludicrously corrupt bidding processes. What's more, the Yemeni civil war, in which the cabinet of Yemen and the Southern Movement are being backed by a brutal Saudi-led coalition, which was also backed by Qatar up until 2017, has been rumbling on for more than 7 years. Saudi Arabia's de facto blockade in Yemen has starved the Yemeni people, including innocent men, women and children, of vital food and medicine that they require to survive. The result has been what was the worst humanitarian crisis on earth before the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan, and remains the second worst, having already claimed the lives of almost 400,000 people. A situation that is only made possible by the US and the UK providing Saudi Arabia with weapons and their continued support. According to the charity Save the Children, by 2018, at least 84,701 Yemeni children had already starved to death as a result of the Saudi blockade. Whilst it would be distasteful, unnecessary, and needless to compare the terror and strife that is currently being faced by the people of Yemen and Ukraine, it would seem to me that the situation in Yemen and Saudi Arabia's role in that conflict could fairly be described at least as devastating and deplorable, yet 7 years and 5 months since it began, FIFA haven't brought any sanctions against Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi state effectively just acquired an 80% stake in Premier League football team Newcastle United. UEFA, meanwhile, who have just decided Putin bad in the last few weeks, had no problem allowing Hungary to host 4 games at Euro 2020 as the country descends further and further into authoritarianism at the hands of Viktor Orban. And in perhaps even more egregious circumstances, Azerbaijan appear to have become the darlings of UEFA in recent years, with Baku having hosted the 2019 Europa League final, along with 4 games at Euro 2020 themselves. That is despite the fact that Azerbaijan ranks close to the foot of virtually every index ranking democracy in the world, press freedom, and human rights abuses. Oh, and on LGBT rights, of course, an index where Hungary also ranks rather dreadfully. Add in the fact that Baku is an absolute nightmare to get to from most European countries, and Henrik Mkhitaryan wasn't even able to travel to Arsenal's 2019 Europa League final against Chelsea due to concerns about his safety, on account of him being Armenian, and the idea that UEFA has banned Russia due to any moral backbone is exposed for the fantasy that it really is. So the party may be over, for now, when it comes to Vladimir Putin and football. But he has already got everything that he wanted out of the sport: legitimacy, popularity, and soft power. He now risks throwing a great deal of that away in Ukraine through what thus far seems to have been a terrible decision, both ethically and strategically, but football can hardly take any credit for that. The fact of the matter is that Vladimir Putin and his sycophantic oligarchs have used football as a means to an end, and the world of football was all too happy to go along for the ride. Football played a role, however large or small, in consolidating Vladimir Putin's control over the Russian Federation and in emboldening his regime, throughout a period in which he committed numerous human rights violations long before Russian troops ever stepped foot in Ukraine. Putin will not be pleased to see Russia placed under sporting sanctions, stripped of the right to host the 2022 Champions League final and this year's Grand Prix, but he also won't be that bothered. For starters, he has got bigger fish to fry at this moment in time, but he has also already extracted everything from football that he wanted, managing to do so with very little genuine opposition. For FIFA, UEFA, and indeed I would argue the Premier League, it is far too little, too late. Whilst there is nothing that those organisations can do to change the past, you might have thought, or at least hoped, that they would make some kind of effort to prevent themselves from making the same mistakes in the future. You would, I'm afraid to say, be sorely mistaken. This has not prompted any wider discussions around the upcoming World Cup in Qatar, UEFA's close ties to Azerbaijan, the ownership of Newcastle United, Manchester City, or PSG. Nothing. I hate to bring up that Tony Robbins quote again, since I've personally always found him to be a bit of a tit, but it is true. By changing nothing, nothing changes. And that is a mantra that football's governing bodies seem to live by. Except they view it as a positive. By changing nothing, nothing changes. Don't ask questions, don't seek improvement, just make sure that the money keeps on flowing. At the opening ceremony of the Confederations Cup in 2017, as Russia prepared to host the World Cup, Vladimir Putin stated that, quote, "We are united in believing that football should serve the purpose of social development, unite nations and continents, reaffirm the values of fair play, enhance determination and faith, and inspire and offer a dream to the younger generation." End quote. He is now in the process of dividing up a nation by recognising pro-Russian republics that virtually no one else does, and separatist groups that he has been backing for years, looking to sow the seeds of separatism in Ukraine, and the only dream that he has offered the younger generation in Ukraine, and indeed many of the younger generation in Russia, whether that be terrified young soldiers fighting on the front line, or young people at home who have been plunged into poverty, is that they manage to make it out of the next few weeks, months, and years alive. At the 2018 World Cup, FIFA president Gianni Infantino boldly declared that this is a new image of Russia that we now have. For anyone who was still in any doubt, I'm sure they do now have a rather different image of Russia under the leadership of Vladimir Putin at least, and it is not one that reflects well on either him, Gianni Infantino, or the world of football. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens, just in case we aren't all obliterated in a nuclear apocalypse and I am able to make some more videos. You can also find me on social media, on Twitter or Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.